Welcome to the Horizon Audiofiles, a podcast of the Defense Horizon Journal. The Defense Horizon Journal is a professional and academic journal that features essays, reports, and analyses covering geopolitics and law, security and defense policy, peace and conflict studies, applied military science, as well as developments in weapons technology. For more information, go to www.tdhj.org.
Episode number 74. How AI Can Help Build Up Societal Resilience Against Disinformation. By Matthias C. Ketterman. Disinformation, a definition. While there is no uniform definition of disinformation, there is now a broad consensus on what it means in practice: the strategic dissemination of false or misleading information deliberately designed to advance political or economic interests and that can cause social harm, mistrust, and fears about the future. Disinformation is not an isolated phenomenon. It is part of online communication and is used by state actors, political parties, especially populist ones, activists, and influencers. The motives range from political influence and government destabilization to the exploitation of the digital attention economy. It is spread through algorithmic prioritization of polarizing content, targeted manipulation of search engines, and the use of generative AI, which creates deepfakes, for example. These aspects influence public discourse and our perception of it. They put the political digital public sphere to the test by reinforcing polarization tendencies and undermining trust in democratic processes and institutions. While disinformation can certainly have an effect, one has to distinguish between exposure to it and perception of it, and the question of whether and to what extent it is effective in changing and shaping opinions. There is a lack of reliable evidence about their actual impact on individual and collective opinion forming. At the same time, however, disinformation is discussed in public debate as a substantial threat to democracy and social cohesion, which may have a greater impact than confronting disinformation itself. Critical engagement with AI-supported disinformation and related media literacy skills are still insufficiently developed. This increases the challenges that disinformation poses for democratic societies. Not necessarily because disinformation is very effective, but because the belief in its effectiveness and its prevalence might reduce societal trust in the governance of societal opinion-forming processes, and that is bad news by and of itself. The challenges of disinformation. The decline in trust in traditional news media correlates with a general loss of confidence in institutions. This trend raises concerns about democratic backsliding, as disinformation is increasingly used to promote political instability and undermine public institutions. While academics are still debating whether this loss of trust represents an actual crisis or is merely a consequence of changing media consumption habits, it is undeniable that concepts such as lying press are being exploited by left and right-wing extremist political actors to deliberately destroy trust in traditional media. These actors, in turn, are partly supported by foreign information operations, particularly from Russia, which is pursuing its own agenda. One example is the undermining of the political will to support Ukraine in its defense against Russia's war of aggression. Comparative studies across countries show that resilience to disinformation depends heavily on each country's political and media environments. While consumption of self-proclaimed alternative media is often associated with lower resilience to misinformation, studies from Canada, France, and the US show that high trust in traditional national news media does not automatically increase resilience to misinformation. This is particularly evident in social media, where the willingness to share, like, or comment on information without checking it does not decrease significantly despite high media trust. Meanwhile, countries with lower gross domestic product tend to have low levels of basic trust in democratic institutions and in quality media, and, reinforced by a lack of basic digital literacy, this creates a breeding ground for greater susceptibility to disinformation. Disinformation as a political tool. The manipulation of information is increasingly being used as a weapon in political disputes. Politicians and digital platform operators claim the authority to interpret what is considered truth and use targeted misinformation to destabilize democratic processes. This development is part of the post-truth era, in which objectifiable facts are replaced by strategically placed opinions and targeted disinformation. As early as the 1960s, philosopher Hannah Arendt warned of the consequences when political actors deny, manipulate, or replace facts. The targeted use of social media to address voters is a central component of modern election campaigns. While scandals such as the one surrounding Cambridge Analytica have shown how companies can spread disinformation through mass, illegal access to personal data, findings on actual effectiveness as opposed to assumed effectiveness are difficult to prove. Regulatory measures such as the EU's Digital Services Act, DSA, of 2022 are now attempting to ensure transparency and accountability, as well as numerous measures of regulated self-regulation, i.e., those that operate at the interface between state and private regulation to secure an online debate that preserves the rights of those involved, in particular freedom of expression and information. The DSA obliges large digital platforms to minimize systemic risks that hurt democratic discourse and electoral processes. However, it remains unclear how such measures can be effectively implemented. Recommendations from other international organizations, such as the Council of Europe on Digital Election Campaigns and the OSCE on Crisis Communication, also emphasize the need for transparent algorithms in political communication. Still, implementing such measures remains challenging, especially given the private autonomy of platform operators, which is also important for preserving freedom of expression. Disinformation and political movements. Disinformation is closely linked to autocratic regimes and the rise of left and right-wing populist movements in Western-style democracies. Russia and the People's Republic of China, PRC, have developed comprehensive strategies to influence public opinion in other countries through targeted information warfare. In Latin America, Russian disinformation campaigns aim to undermine trust in Western institutions such as NATO and the EU. In Africa, information warriors from the Wagner Group and now also the PRC strategic communication agents have attempted to steer national political processes in line with the Belt and Road Initiative. Digital platforms and the spread of disinformation. While search engines play a role in amplifying false and misleading information, social media platforms are the main channels for spreading disinformation. Platforms such as Facebook, X, formerly Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube significantly influence content visibility through their algorithms. Despite growing criticism of the operators and their actions, measures to combat disinformation often remain ineffective. Furthermore, messaging services such as WhatsApp and Telegram pose a particular challenge, as disinformation can be mainly spread unchecked on these platforms. Studies on the influence of social media on political polarization have yielded mixed results. While some research suggests that social media reinforces echo chambers, other studies show that users are indeed exposed to different perspectives. A study in France, the United Kingdom, and the US found no evidence that social media directly contributes to support for right-wing populist parties. Instead, personal offline exchanges appear to be a stronger influencing factor. Nevertheless, there is evidence that algorithms tend to amplify right-wing content. A study from 2021 showed that the Twitter algorithm disproportionately amplified conservative voices, while left-wing content was recommended less often. Since Musk's takeover of Twitter and his deliberate interventions in the recommendation system, the situation has worsened. Ironically, this privileging of right-wing voices often goes hand in hand with perceived or felt discrimination against them and resulting calls for an end to the censorship of conservative content on social media. The recent paradigm shift in moderation practices on Facebook Meta following Trump's second inauguration seems to clearly point toward less moderation and thus more opportunities for the dissemination of disinformation content. Measures to strengthen media literacy. In view of the growing threat of disinformation, many governments and organizations are focusing on promoting media and information literacy, MIL. These educational measures are designed to enable people to critically question information and recognize disinformation. Studies show that such programs are more effective in the long term when offered continuously. A relatively new area within media and information literacy is AI literacy, i.e., understanding how AI works and its impact on information systems. As AI increasingly shapes the creation and dissemination of news, people must learn to critically evaluate algorithmically generated content. AI literacy programs aim to educate users about the mechanisms of machine learning, algorithmic biases, and the limitations of AI-generated content. The Risk Perception Index of the Global Risks Report, published by the World Economic Forum in Davos, WEF, analyzes the most serious risks facing the world over the next 10 years. While long-term climate-related threats dominate the list of significant risks, experts and executives surveyed identify misinformation and disinformation as the most significant global risk to a successful geoeconomically and geostrategically stable future in 2024 and 2025. This is particularly attributable to the growing spread of AI-generated content, which could promote misrepresentation of events and the spread of false narratives. The survey reveals fears that misinformation and disinformation could significantly disrupt electoral processes in several economies over the next 2 years. Growing mistrust of all information, as well as of the media and governments as sources, could further polarize society. However, there is also a perceived risk of repression and restrictions on fundamental rights such as freedom of expression and freedom of the press if authorities attempt to curb the spread of mere misinformation. From the perspective of the economic elite surveyed, this leads to a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation for governments and state agencies. However, this assessment may also illustrate a certain deformation a professionally distorted perception of the problems, as the respondents to the World Economic Forum survey included few experts on democracy and media, but mainly individuals from the banking and financial sector. The fact that the specific threat of disinformation ranked first in the Risk Perception Index in both 2024 and 2025, without having demonstrably led to the feared substantial consequences on a large scale, says more about the respondents' resistance to experience than about the actual threat situation. It is not only disinformation that is the problem, but also, as mentioned at the outset, the uncritical portrayal and discourse about disinformation as a problem for democracy. Consequently, it appears to be better to scandalize less and invest more in media and information literacy. Conclusion: disinformation poses a multi-layered threat to democratic societies. It undermines trust in the media and institutions, is deliberately used as a political tool, and is amplified by digital platforms. While regulatory measures such as the Digital Services Act increasingly focus on transparency and platform responsibility, their enforcement remains a challenge. At the same time, educational initiatives to promote media and AI literacy are gaining importance to better equip individuals to combat disinformation. In the long term, combating disinformation will require a comprehensive approach that includes both political regulation and strengthened media literacy. Technological change necessitates that political actors, media companies, and educational institutions jointly develop strategies to safeguard the integrity of public debate and mitigate the negative effects of disinformation. However, it is also clear that excessive, uncritical, and unsubstantiated discussion of disinformation is of limited help. Even disinformation about disinformation is harmful, perhaps even more so than disinformation itself. The author, Matthias C. Kettermann, is Professor of Innovation, Theory, and Philosophy of Law at the University of Innsbruck. After his studies in Graz, Geneva, and Harvard, he obtained his habilitation in Frankfurt. His research focuses on the normative order of the Internet, international law, and digital governance. The views contained in this article are the author's alone.
This was the Horizon Audiofiles, a podcast of the Defense Horizon Journal. For more information, go to www.tdhj.org. Thank you for listening.